The sound of sirens echoed through the valley, breaking the peaceful morning stillness of my cattle ranch. I stood on my front porch, coffee in hand, watching as 3 police cruisers and an animal control truck barreled down my dirt road like they were responding to a full-scale riot. Dust billowed behind them, mixing with the rising sun, and for a moment I wondered if the apocalypse had finally arrived. It sure felt like it. Then I spotted her. Deborah Winslow, HOA president, self-appointed neighborhood sheriff, and the single most infuriating woman to ever step foot near my land. She stood at the edge of my property, arms crossed over her chest, wearing that smug expression I had come to associate with pure, unfiltered nonsense. Her phone was clutched tightly in one hand, and I had no doubt she had dialed 911 with the same urgency as someone reporting a bank robbery. The sheriff's cruiser skidded to a halt, and out stepped Dale Parker, an old friend who looked half amused and half annoyed. He took one glance at me, then at Deborah, and I could already tell he was questioning all his life choices that led him to this moment. "Morning, Jake," he greeted, adjusting his belt. "You want to explain why we got a 911 call about uncontrolled livestock terrorizing the community?" I raised an eyebrow and glanced at Deborah, who huffed indignantly before launching into one of her infamous tirades. "Yes, Sheriff, I called," she declared, chin raised. "This man," she jabbed a finger in my direction, "has refused to contain his dangerous animals. There were cows, right outside my backyard, staring into my home. My guests were terrified, and frankly, this has gone too far. I demand something be done." I blinked at her, then looked at Dale. "Cows." She called 911 for cows. "Don't act like this is a joke." Deborah snapped. "They were aggressive." Dale pinched the bridge of his nose, exhaling slowly as if summoning the patience of a saint. "Ma'am," he started, his voice tight with restraint, "this is a cattle ranch. Cows exist here. That's kind of the whole point." "Not near my property," she shrieked. "I moved here for peace, not farm animals." I let out a slow whistle. "You moved next to a ranch, in cattle country, and you're mad about cows." Deborah turned red, but before she could respond, the animal control officer stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Sir, we do have to at least check." I cut him off with a wave of my hand. "Knock yourselves out," I said, gesturing toward the fields. "But let me save you some time. My fences are intact, my cows are on my land, and legally, they have the right to exist. Unlike some people who like to stick their noses where they don't belong." Deborah gasped, scandalized. "Are you insinuating that I don't belong in my own neighborhood?" "I'm insinuating that you don't belong on my ranch, making false police reports." Dale turned toward the animal control officer. "Do you see any stampeding wild beasts, Jerry?" Jerry sighed, looking around at my perfectly calm, grazing cattle. "Nope. Just some cows minding their business." Dale clapped his hands together. "Well, there you have it. Ma'am, you've wasted county resources over a personal vendetta. Again. So unless you want to be cited for misuse of emergency services, I suggest you go home and leave this man alone." Deborah's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, her face cycling through about 3 different shades of red. "This isn't over," she finally spat, jabbing a finger toward me. "The HOA has rules, and you will pay for your violations." I snorted. "I'd love to see the HOA bylaws on cows existing where they belong." She stormed off, stomping toward her Lexus parked on the side of the road. The officers, sensing their time had been thoroughly wasted, followed suit. Dale gave me a knowing look before getting back into his cruiser. "She's gonna keep coming at you, you know," he said through the open window. I smirked. "Let her try." As they drove off, I took another sip of my coffee, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. Deborah had made herself my problem, but what she didn't realize was that I wasn't the kind of man to roll over and let a glorified neighborhood committee dictate how I ran my family's land. She wanted a war? She just picked the wrong cowboy to fight. 2 days later, I got my first official notice from the HOA. Dear ranch owner, it read, you are in violation of Clear Creek Estates community guidelines. Your livestock's presence within view of residential properties is disruptive and must be rectified immediately. Failure to comply will result in escalating fines. I laughed so hard I nearly fell out of my chair. She actually thought she could fine me for existing. I marched right over to the HOA office, a fancy little building that looked more like a country club than an administrative space. The receptionist, a nervous-looking young man who clearly wasn't paid enough, paled the moment he saw me step inside. Mr. Lawson?" he stammered. "That's me," I said, tipping my hat. "Got a little letter about my cows being a public menace. Figured I'd come clear up some things." Before he could respond, a familiar shrill voice cut through the room. "You!" Deborah appeared from an office, her face twisting into something between triumph and malice. "I knew you'd come crawling in here. Ready to negotiate, I assume?" I chuckled. "Negotiate what?" "Whether or not my cows continue existing." She smiled, teeth bared like a predator sensing weakness. "The board has decided that livestock must remain out of view of the community at all times. If you don't comply, we will be forced to take legal action." That's when I dropped the papers onto the counter. "Well, Deborah, I did some digging," I said, watching her expression shift. "Turns out this land? The one you and your little HOA control?" I tapped the papers. "It actually still belongs to an old county grant. And guess who happens to own the rights to that land?" The color drained from her face. I leaned in, dropping my voice just enough to let her know I wasn't bluffing. "Me." Silence stretched so thick you could have cut it with a knife. The receptionist's eyes darted between us, looking like he wanted to be anywhere but here. Deborah swallowed. "You're lying." I grinned. "Oh, I wish I was." She reached for the papers, scanning them with shaking hands. As realization sank in, I saw something I never expected from Deborah Winslow. Panic. And just like that, the game changed. The moment Deborah's eyes darted across the papers, scanning the legal documents with growing horror, I knew I had her backed into a corner. The color had drained from her face, her fingers trembled slightly, and for the first time since she had made my life a living nightmare, she looked uncertain. That smug confidence, that self-righteous arrogance, all of it cracked under the weight of the realization that she had just picked a fight with the wrong man. This is a mistake," she stammered, flipping through the pages like she could somehow will them to say something different. "There is no way, no possible way that you own the land the HOA is built on." I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms as I watched her unravel. "You ever hear about old county land grants, Deborah? The kind that were handed down through generations? See, back in the day, the government handed out land to families who were willing to settle and work it. My great-grandfather had a claim that overlapped with this area, but since no one cared back then, the land wasn't officially transferred out of my family's name when they started selling off plots for this fancy little development. Turns out the HOA clubhouse, your community park, and even some of the streets fall under the original deed. And guess what, Deborah?" I smirked, letting the words sink in. "The county never processed the land transfer correctly, which means all of that land technically still belongs to me." She shook her head violently. No, this is ridiculous. The HOA has been operating here for years. We've built homes, roads, a whole community. There's no way you can just claim ownership now." I tapped the top of the document. "It's not a claim. It's a fact. And legally, that means I have the right to charge rent or even reclaim the land entirely. Which, if I'm being honest, is starting to sound like a mighty fine idea." The room was so silent I could hear the hum of the cheap office fluorescent lights. The receptionist looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. Deborah, on the other hand, was still gripping the papers like they were cursed, her mind working in overdrive to find a way out of this mess. Then, like a dying fire grasping for one last spark, she straightened her back and scoffed. "This is nothing but a pathetic attempt to intimidate me. The HOA has lawyers. Real lawyers. who will tear through this so-called claim of yours and expose it for the fraud that it is. I shrugged. Be my guest. But I already had a real lawyer verify everything. And let's not forget, my lawyer doesn't have to fight against the county records. Yours do. The confidence flickered in her eyes, but she wasn't going down without a fight. She turned on her heel, storming back toward her office, but I wasn't done yet. Oh, and Deborah? I called after her. She paused but didn't turn around. I'll be drafting up rental agreements for the common areas I own. You might want to let your HOA board know that they'll be paying me for the privilege of existing on my land. She stormed out, slamming the door so hard the walls rattled. The fallout was immediate. By the time I got back to my ranch, I had already received 3 calls from unknown numbers, all of which I ignored. The 4th one, however, came from Sheriff Dale Parker, so I picked up. Well, Jake, he said, barely able to contain his amusement. You sure know how to kick a hornet's nest. I chuckled. Oh, I know. I just didn't expect the hornets to start buzzing this fast. The HOA board is in full panic mode, Dale continued. Apparently, Deborah went straight to an emergency meeting, waving those documents around like a crazy woman. They're talking about getting lawyers, pushing for an emergency land transfer, and, get this, trying to fine you for misuse of community spaces. I nearly choked on my coffee. They're trying to fine me? For my own land. That's the rumor. Well, I guess I'll have to start sending them invoices for back rent. Fair's fair. Dale let out a low whistle. You're enjoying this way too much. Dale, my friend, I have had to deal with that woman trying to ruin my life for months. She called 911 on my cows, tried to slap me with bogus violations, and now she's finding out I own the very ground she walks on? This is the best entertainment I've had in years. Dale laughed. Well, just keep an eye out. She's not the type to take defeat lying down. I didn't have to wait long to see what her next move would be. The very next morning, I woke up to find my fence cut in 3 different places, and a few of my cattle had wandered dangerously close to the HOA's community park. Not only was it a clear act of sabotage, but it also put my livestock in danger. If a car had been speeding down the road at the wrong time, one of my cows could have been hit. I wasn't about to let that slide. I checked my security cameras, and sure enough, I spotted 2 figures sneaking around my property the night before. One of them was none other than Deborah's husband, Richard. That was all I needed. I made a call to Dale, and within the hour, he and his deputies were at Deborah's house. The sight of the sheriff's cruiser pulling up in her pristine driveway was a thing of beauty. I stood at the property line, arms crossed, as Dale knocked on her door. It took a few minutes, but when Deborah finally answered, her face twisted in barely contained rage. What is the meaning of this? She snapped, eyes darting toward me. Dale pulled out his notepad. We have evidence that someone trespassed onto Jake's property and intentionally damaged his fences, which led to livestock escaping. Deborah scoffed. Oh, please. Like anyone would waste their time doing such a thing. I grinned. You might want to ask your husband about that. Her face paled. What? Dale turned his notepad toward her, showing a still image from the security footage. It was grainy, but clear enough to make out Richard, bolt cutters in hand, slicing through my fence. Deborah's mouth opened, then closed. Then opened again. There must be some misunderstanding. Dale sighed. Look, Deborah, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. But right now, it's looking a whole lot like criminal trespassing and destruction of property. Richard suddenly appeared in the doorway, his expression one of pure dread. I didn't mean any harm, he stammered. It was just a prank. A prank, I repeated flatly. So what was the joke? My cattle getting hit by a car? Deborah was fuming, but she was trapped. She knew it, I knew it, and Dale sure as hell knew it. We'll discuss this with our lawyer, she finally spat. Dale gave a slow nod. You do that. But if I were you, I'd start considering some apologies before this gets any worse. As they disappeared back into their house, I let out a long breath, shaking my head. Deborah had declared war. Too bad for her, I had just gotten started. The days that followed were nothing short of chaotic. The HOA was in full crisis mode, scrambling to find a way to undo the legal mess they had just stumbled into. Calls were being made to county officials, emails were flying between desperate board members, and I could only imagine the frantic late-night meetings where Deborah barked orders, demanding someone, anyone, fix this disaster before it got worse. But the truth was, there was nothing they could do. The documents didn't lie. The land belonged to me, and unless they could rewrite history, they were stuck. I made sure to remind them of that fact every chance I got. Official notices were sent to the HOA board, outlining my new terms. If they wanted to continue using the common areas, the park, the clubhouse, even the private road they prided themselves on, they would need to start paying rent. I kept the prices reasonable, more as a way to rub salt in the wound rather than actually trying to bankrupt them. I wanted them to feel the weight of their own arrogance, to understand what it meant to try and push someone around only to end up trapped by their own schemes. Deborah, of course, fought back with everything she had. She tried to convince homeowners to refuse payment, rallying them into believing they could simply ignore my claim and that, eventually, I would give up. What she didn't anticipate was that not everyone in the HOA was willing to blindly follow her into battle. Some of the more level-headed residents realized that the last thing they needed was a long and expensive legal fight over land that wasn't even theirs to begin with. Whispers of frustration spread, and before long, I started getting quiet visits from board members who wanted to negotiate separately, away from Deborah's influence. It didn't take long for her to notice the cracks forming in her empire. The more people started seeing reason, the more unhinged she became. She accused the board members of betraying her, of being weak, of giving in to a land thief who had no right to be making demands. It was clear she was losing control, and in her desperation, she made her biggest mistake yet. One morning, I received a notice that the HOA was attempting to claim eminent domain over my portion of the land. Apparently, Deborah had managed to convince enough people that if they could declare my property essential to the community, they could force the county to seize it from me. It was a bold move, I'd give her that, but it was also incredibly stupid. The law didn't work that way, and the county had no interest in stepping into what was, at its core, a petty neighborhood dispute. I didn't even have to lift a finger to shut it down. The county office sent back a response so fast it was almost embarrassing, flatly rejecting the request and reminding the HOA that private property rights weren't something they could just override because they didn't like who owned the land. Deborah was furious, and the last shred of patience her board members had for her finally snapped. The next HOA meeting was a spectacle for the ages. I made a point to attend, sitting in the back while the board members turned on their so-called fearless leader one by one. The treasurer was the first to speak up, his voice dripping with frustration as he laid out the financial disaster they were facing. The legal fees they had already accumulated just trying to challenge my land claim were enough to make half the room visibly pale. The secretary followed, reminding everyone that Deborah had made all these decisions without consulting the homeowners, dragging them into a fight most of them didn't want to be part of. And then the real fun began. Homeowners started standing up, demanding to know why they were now expected to pay rent for land they had been told was part of the HOA. People were angry, confused, and most importantly, tired of Deborah's nonsense. "You told us this was a minor issue," one woman shouted. "Now we're looking at hundreds of dollars in extra fees just to keep using the park? My property value is already dropping because of this mess," another man complained. "Who's going to compensate me for that?" "You." Deborah, for the first time since this whole ordeal started, looked genuinely cornered. She tried to regain control, insisting that I was the real problem, that I was manipulating the situation, that I was the one they should be angry at. But it was too late. The room had turned against her, and it was clear she was done. By the end of the meeting, a vote was called. In a landslide decision, Deborah was removed as HOA president, stripped of her authority, and left standing alone as the very people she had ruled over cast her out. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought that, finally, I could put this whole ridiculous ordeal behind me. But Deborah, being Deborah, couldn't just accept defeat quietly. A few days later, I woke up to find a moving truck parked outside her house. At first, I assumed she was packing up and leaving, but then I saw what was actually happening. Deborah wasn't moving out. She was moving something in. Right in the middle of her front yard, surrounded by a team of workers who looked like they had been given orders by a lunatic, was a massive, gaudy, hand-painted sign that read, HOA Victims Unite, Fight Land Theft. I nearly dropped my coffee. She had turned her home into some kind of bizarre protest site, complete with banners, signs, and even a small podium. She was handing out pamphlets to anyone who would listen, warning them about the dangers of greedy land barons and the corrupt system that allows ranchers to steal from hard-working homeowners. I should have been angry. I should have been annoyed. But honestly, I just laughed. She had officially lost it. A few days later, the new HOA president reached out to me with a deal. They were willing to pay rent for the common areas, keep their residents in check, and formally acknowledge my ownership, on one condition. They wanted me to get rid of Deborah. I didn't even have to do anything extreme. All it took was one quiet conversation with a few higher-ups in the county, and suddenly, Deborah's little protest camp became a violation of multiple city ordinances. Within a week, she was slapped with more fines than she could count, and when she refused to comply, the city ordered her to remove every sign, every banner, and every trace of her so-called movement. The last time I saw her, she was standing on her front porch, watching as workers tore down her giant protest sign. Her face was a mix of rage and exhaustion, but I could see it in her eyes. She had finally realized she lost. A month later, her house went up for sale. And just for fun, I made an offer. I didn't even want the house. I just wanted to make sure she knew that, in the end, I had won. She declined, of course. But the victory was already mine.